All right, buckle up because this deep dive is a rough one. We're talking about the case of Hisashi Ouchi, the most radioactive man, they called him.
Yeah, it's a tough story to stomach. Really shows you the sheer destructive force of radiation. The way these accidents can just devastate lives and whole communities.
So, rewind to 1999, Tokimura nuclear plant in Japan. Ouchi and a coworker are working with uranium, the heart of a nuclear reactor, and they're mixing it with nitric acid, which, from what I understand, is a pretty delicate process.
Absolutely, you need absolute precision in a nuclear plant. Yeah. Highly trained people, strict safety measures, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, and that's where it all went south. A recipe for disaster, human error, safety protocols that weren't tight enough, and boom, criticality accident.
Like a tiny atomic bomb going off right there in the plant. They accidentally triggered a runaway nuclear chain reaction.
And Ouchi, he's closest to it, gets slammed with this insane dose of radiation, like 17,000 millisieverts. We're talking hundreds of times more than what's considered safe for a radiation worker in a year.
It's just unfathomable. Even Chernobyl first responders, they saw a fraction of that, and we know how bad that was, this amount. It's immediate catastrophic damage.
Yeah.
Tears apart your body at the cellular level. There's just no fixing that.
So no long-term effects to even worry about. This is instant. What does that kind of radiation actually do to a person?
So our bodies, we're constantly making new cells, right? But radiation messes with the instructions those cells use. Like imagine scrambling the blueprints for a building. Suddenly the body can't repair itself right.
So it's like his DNA was scrambled.
Essentially.
No wonder it said his body basically started to fall apart.
It's a tragic story. And while Tokimura might not have the same name recognition as Chernobyl, the human cost was immense. Just goes to show you, even when the danger seems distant, nuclear energy can have devastating consequences.
It's easy to get stuck on the sheer scale of the radiation, but we're talking about a person here, Hisashi Ouchi.
Oh, absolutely. It's all too easy to get lost in the science, but Ouchi's story, it reminds us that these accidents, they leave real human wreckage behind.
And he didn't, it wasn't instant. He clung to life for 83 days.
83 days of pure agony. Just hours after the exposure, his body started to turn on itself. The radiation was tearing him apart from the inside out. Burns, organ failure, constant nausea.
Yeah.
A slow, agonizing shutdown of his entire system.
God, it's hard to even fathom. The research we looked at described his skin sloughing off, internal bleeding. His chromosomes were so damaged they were literally unraveling. And he was bleeding from his eyes.
Yeah, that's a common symptom in severe radiation sickness.
Yeah.
His blood couldn't clot, his tissues couldn't repair, infections ran rampant, his body just couldn't keep up.
And through all of that, he was conscious.
For a good portion of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being aware that your own body is betraying you and there's nothing you can do to stop it?
It's just, there are accounts of him begging the doctors to let him die. He even said, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig."
And that's where the ethical dilemma really comes in, right? Here are these doctors pushing the boundaries of medicine, trying to keep him alive. Skin grafts, experimental treatments. They even tried a bone marrow transplant from his sister.
Trying to rebuild a man who was basically disintegrating at the cellular level, and his sister donating bone marrow to try and kickstart his immune system.
An incredibly selfless act. But even the transplanted cells, they were destroyed by the radiation. There was just so much of it. Throughout his body, they were dealing with something they'd never seen before.
It sounds like they were just delaying the inevitable, prolonging his suffering in the name of medical progress. Was it really merciful to keep him alive that long?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that's still being debated today. There's a book, A Slow Death, that really digs into the ethics of his treatment. That fine line between keeping someone alive and just extending their suffering.
83 days in agonizing pain. Just the mental and physical strength it must take in just to hold on. And the emotional toll on the medical staff.
Absolutely, you can't discount that. The kind of trauma this inflicted, not just on Ouchi, but the people who are desperately trying to save him.
Yeah.
That's real.
It's tough to even think about going through something like that. And as awful as it is, Ouchi's case, it wasn't entirely isolated, right? What about his coworker, Shinohara, and the others at the plant?
It's tough to talk about. Shinohara, he received a slightly lower dose, but, lower is a relative term here. He still went through absolute hell. Radiation sickness, organ failure, infections, just wouldn't let up. He fought for months, but ultimately died the next year. And we can't forget about the other workers, the people living nearby. They were exposed to, maybe not to the same extent, but still, Lives changed forever, dealing with the fear of long-term health problems, the trauma of that day. It's heavy stuff.
Yeah, no kidding. Really highlights how far reaching these incidents are, the ripple effect they have. What about the company JCO? What consequences did they face for something this disastrous?
Oh, they were in hot water for sure. Criminal charges for negligence, for inadequate training, all of it. They lost their operating license, obviously, and had to pay millions of dollars in compensation to the victims and their families. Even the president of JCO ended up doing time.
I mean, that almost feels like a slap on the wrist considering what happened.
Right. But Ouchi's story, it goes beyond lawsuits and settlements. It makes us rethink our whole relationship with nuclear energy, you know?
Yeah, it'd be easy to dismiss this as a one-off, a freak accident, but it feels like it reveals something much bigger, like about safety culture, about regulations, about the true cost of pushing these technological boundaries.
Exactly. This wasn't just about one man suffering. This exposed cracks in the foundation of an entire industry. And Ouchi's story, as hard as it is to hear, it forces us to ask some tough questions. Are we doing enough to prevent this from happening again? Are we protecting the people who work with these dangerous materials? How do we balance the potential benefits with these very real risks?
Hisashi Ouchi, the most radioactive man in history, he endured unimaginable suffering, and it really forces us to confront these big questions about medical intervention, about ethics, about the limits of what we're willing to do to save a life.
And while Tokemura did lead to some changes in safety protocols, the Fukushima disaster, just a few years later, that showed us there's still a long way to go. Ouchi's story, it's a stark reminder of the potential human cost of nuclear power, and it really drives home that technological progress shouldn't come at the expense of human life.
Absolutely. It's a sobering reminder for all of us to think critically about where our energy comes from, to demand accountability from the people in charge of these powerful technologies. We can't change what happened to Hisashi Ouchi, but hopefully, by remembering his story, we can try to prevent something like this from ever happening again.